need for more inquiry. It should not have been dismissed. Odd that the odd Capitol Police statement, anybody that's done this type of work before sees their case, as Mark said, a CIA guy who's been doing this his entire career says it's very obvious they're casing the joint. They're taking photos, and again, you got a member of Congress lying about an insurrection against the United States of America and against our government, trying to overthrow an election, overthrow American democracy, stop the peaceful transition. And he's got a guy who's casing the joint where cops were brutalized and beaten, and he's still lying through his teeth.
And when first asked about it, he said he didn't give a tour at all. So ask yourself why he would lie about giving a tour on January the 5th.
That's why there's got to be consequences for the leaders who were part of this, those that planned it. There have been several hundred people, I believe, indicted or charged already. But they've been people who are actively involved on the ground at the Capitol. The people who planned it, aided, and abetted it, the reason why there's got to be consequences, Joe, or it happens again, or people believe that this isn't acceptable, when you have people calling it a dust-up,
right?
When you have people dismissing it and saying move on, these pictures are so powerful that without consequences, you send a message that this is acceptable.
And by the way, the politicians, Donald Trump, all the other crackpots that were using this as a grift to make money.
To make money.
They knew exactly what
Hundreds
they were
of
doing.
millions.
I will tell you, as angry as I get personally seeing those people on the mall, I don't think those people were there as part of a grift. Those people were there because they had been convinced by someone they voted for, by someone they believed in.
It was organized political activity.
Right. They believed that the election had been stolen. That's the only reason they'd go up there. They're not going up there for the grift. And so the idea that we send them to prison and allow Donald Trump to make $250 million on the big grift.
And pay people $60,000 to speak at a rally.
Right.
2 minutes.
A 2-minute speech. Pay a member of the family $60,000 to give a 2-minute introduction of Don Jr. to continue to give money. But again, let me say this again. Donald Trump raised $250 million off of the big lie in the biggest of grift. And so the question is, why is he still at Mar-a-Lago?
And where's that money?
And these people who can't afford law, a lot of them can't afford lawyers, can't afford what they're going through. Why are these people in jail? Now, they should be in jail. But they aren't the ones that ran the conspiracy. This would be like putting Jim and Tammy Faye Baker's dupes. Sadly, my grandma was one of them, writing check after check after check to the PTL club. Like, this would be like saying, oh, well, Jim and Tammy lied forever, built a corrupt ministry. It's like blame the people who were victimized by that lie. So there has to be consequences. There has to be consequences for Donald Trump and everybody from the top up, not just for the cops who were beaten, the cops who died of a stroke the next day, the cops who committed suicide because they went through that day, but also for the people who were lied to, whose lives have been forever destroyed, not because they faced justice, because we still do have justice in the United States of America, but because it was Donald Trump who put them at the Capitol and by extension put them in their jail cell.
And he puts his supporters on the line by calling them patriots, by flattering them, calling them beautiful people. There was a lot of love that day. But what he's really doing is taking the money out of their pockets, $20 at a time, to the tune of $250 million, and watching them go to prison while he sits at Mar-a-Lago and plays golf. That's how he really feels about the people who support him. And Caddy K, we can talk about the tour, but equally disturbing is the video the next day of one of the people who is alleged to have been on the tour with Congressman Loudermilk. It just speaks to the intent of that crowd, why they thought they were there, how seriously they took their purpose, that they've been sent there by President Trump, prepared to commit violence against members of Congress.
Yeah, there are still a few questions, aren't there, surrounding this video. We don't know yet whether those people who were on that tour and who are speaking about taking out Nancy Pelosi, taking out AOC and Chuck Schumer, whether they actually went into the Capitol. Perhaps we'll hear more about that when we get the committee hearings today. But we don't know whether they were just kind of talking tough, which they certainly are talking tough when you listen to that video, or whether they actually went into the building and were part of the people who were there saying that they were going to hang Mike Pence once they were inside the building. So there are still some questions surrounding this, but questions certainly for Congressman Loudermilk. Well, why did he deny that he had taken a tour? And it's not just like one family with one kid. There's other people hanging on this tour too. I was texting with a Democratic member of Congress whose office is in that area last night and who was there on January the 6th during the insurrection, who'd been hiding in his office, and said, you know, it's really chilling to see them taking photographs of the staircase where my office is and think, you know, what were they planning to do? What was the intent? Nobody goes to that staircase. Nobody photographs that staircase. It's not remotely interesting to anybody. And, you know, I think for a lot of members of Congress who are watching this, it revives memories of that day when they were scared for their lives. I was calling them on that day. They were scared. They didn't know if they were going to get out alive. And then to see a fellow member of Congress with a group that is taking photographs that potentially led to your office door, I think that's very chilling.
Welcome aboard, Captain.
If you tie the knot, lose your health coverage or get let go, or welcome someone new to the family, Cover California helps you get health insurance when life changes and financial help if you need it. Learn more at coveredca.com. Time is limited.
Yesterday, or late the day before, a 12-page letter was released to the media, supposedly written by Donald Trump, weighing in on the Trump Riot Committee hearings. Now, I don't believe for a second that Donald Trump really wrote a 12-page letter. Trump doesn't write and Trump doesn't read. All he's capable of, as far as we've seen, is tweet-style messages, often with strange grammar, spelling, and syntax. So I don't believe Trump wrote a 12-page letter. But I do believe that Trump sat somewhere and told someone what to write. And Chris Cillizza from CNN received the letter and gave us a list of the wackiest things. And here are some key moments from this statement that shows us how the right is thinking of these hearings. Number one, if they had any real evidence, they'd hold real hearings with equal representation. Remember, Republicans opted out of that. There was a framework for an actual bipartisan committee, 10 members, 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, Democratic chair, Republican vice chair, and both the chair and vice chair have to agree on every subpoena. Republicans rejected it. So Democrats did what they could, which is they've got Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger on the panel. So that's their fault. 2, they used the illegally constituted committee to put on a smoke and mirrors show for the American people in a pitiful last-ditch effort to deceive the American public again. There's nothing illegal about the committee. Just nothing. We've had other committees, the Benghazi one, we've had others. Perfectly legal. Number 3, they've refused to allow their political opponents to participate in the process. they've excluded exculpatory witnesses and anyone who so easily points out the flaws in their story. Again, as Crystal writes, Republicans crushed the actual bipartisan committee that they wanted to do. That it is because of Republicans that they don't have more Republicans on the committee. And also, a whole bunch of the pro-Trump people that were subpoenaed didn't go, and that's now the subject of legislation. That includes Steve Bannon and Peter Navarro. 4, the Unselect Pseudo Committee has coordinated with their media puppets to broadcast their witnesses on TV without opposition, cross-examination, or rebuttal evidence. Again, more than 1,000 depositions were taken of all sorts of witnesses. It is untrue that that is what was done. And then a whole bunch of other just repetition of lies. I won't look at all of these, but number 7 is they illegally inflated voter rolls. That's unproven. They illegally allowed harvested and stuffed ballots. No evidence of that. They abused the use of mail-in ballots. There's no evidence of that. They physically removed Republicans from counting facilities. That's untrue. Now, there are random Republicans who showed up demanding to oversee the election who were not allowed to because there's a process for establishing observers. There were Republican and Democratic observers. There were people who just showed up demanding access. It's sort of like if I go to a court and I say I want to sit alongside the judge, they would say, well, no, you haven't been selected. You're not the judge. In the same way, if I'm not actually an election observer, I don't have a right to just show up and be given power there. But there is no evidence for any of those claims. And a whole bunch of other stuff that doesn't really have any meaning, like Donald Trump writing in this letter, on election night, America watched as my lead grew over Biden as I was set to claim another victory. We expected that the early vote would favor Trump, and that as the cities were counted overnight and into the next day, it would start to point more in the direction of Joe Biden. All of these things we expected. So I don't believe Trump wrote this, but I do believe he had input, and it really shows us that they aren't changing their talking points. Every day that passes, we have more of an empirical basis to reject their claims, but they continue making the exact same claims day after day after day. Now, at the end of the day, I don't know that these hearings are really going to have any impact. They're getting an okay audience. My guess is the people watching are mostly the people who already don't believe the things that Donald Trump has been saying. So whether these hearings will have any impact whatsoever remains to be seen. But the lies that they are telling continue to be the exact same lies. And at this point, I don't know who's falling for them. We'll have more on this on our Instagram, which you can find at David Pakman Show. We'll be back right after this short break. Many of us know what it's like to have acne show up when we least want it to. You should have seen me in middle school. Now I'm on camera and I really do the best I can to keep my skin clear. And for that I go to Apostrophe, our sponsor, on the Apostrophe website. You just answer a few questions, take a couple pictures of your skin, and then you have a virtual visit with a board-certified dermatologist who will create a personalized treatment plan. They quickly ship you the prescription medication. I can tell you that when it comes to acne, you're better off with a dermatologist. There are all sorts of different kinds of acne that need different types of treatment. The over-the-counter stuff was not what worked for me. Apostrophe makes it simple and quick. I've had a great experience with Apostrophe myself. You get affordable, quality medical treatment from a licensed dermatologist and prescription meds that actually work. But I can do it all on my phone. I don't have to spend hours in a doctor's office. My audience gets $50 off your first dermatology visit. Go to apostrophe.com/Pacman and use the code Pacman. The link is in the description.
Hi, I'm Smokey Bear, and I made an assistant to help you out, because only you can prevent wildfires.
Hey, Assistant Smokey Bear. Call me Papa Bear, because I'm grilling up dinner. Did you get it?
Yes, good job.
So, what should I do with all these coals?
Don't just toss them out. Put them in a metal container because those embers can start a wildfire.
I understand. The stakes are high.
Ha, 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 ha.
See, Smokey thinks I'm funny.
Welcome aboard, Captain.
What? What about it? What are you talking about? Oh. Put something out here.
Another cooperator. Today, another member of the pro-Trump right-wing paramilitary group, the Proud Boys, pled guilty for his role in the January 6th attack and also agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. This makes three members of the so-called Proud Boys who've pled guilty. One of those who's cooperating is cooperating in the seditious conspiracy case the Justice Department has brought against the group. There's also a seditious conspiracy case pending against the members of another proto-fascist, pro-Trump paramilitary group called the Oath Keepers. Seditious conspiracy is a specific, rarely charged, very serious crime that the Justice Department has had a heck of a time in previous cases proving it. The very few times it's ever been used in the U.S. criminal law. But one of the things we are learning from the indictments and from the court filings in those sedition cases and in the public hearings for the January 6th investigation is that these paramilitary groups were apparently an important, integral part of the plot to try to overthrow the government, to stop the certification of the last election by using force inside the U.S. Capitol. The January 6th investigators have laid out how hundreds of these Proud Boys marched to the Capitol hours before Trump directed the crowd at his rally that they should go to the Capitol. They started attacking police just as Trump started sending the big mob their way. They were effectively the tip of the spear. They breached the Capitol, and then the mob was there to roll in behind them. The chairman of the January 6th investigation says at upcoming hearings, witnesses will describe conversations between these paramilitary groups that led the breach of the Capitol and people in the orbit of then President Trump. They're charged with sedition. And then there's him. But, you know, these aren't the only fascist right-wing paramilitary groups that are operating on the bleeding edge of right-wing politics right now. Just this past weekend, for example, there was this.
These guys stopped a U-Haul full of dudes.
A swarm of extremists who Idaho police say came to riot. 31 suspected white nationalists zip-tied and arrested blocks from a pride festival.
There was at least one smoking grenade. There was multiple shields.
Coeur d'Alene police Saturday discovered the crowd crammed in a U-Haul after a 911 caller described seeing a little army at a local hotel with masks on their faces and slogans like Reclaim America on their shirts. Police charging all 31 with conspiracy to riot, noting they planned to swarm several parts of Coeur d'Alene and carried paperwork similar to an operations plan that a police or military group would put together. They traveled in from states all across the country, allegedly united by white nationalism.
They appeared to be affiliated with the group Patriot Front.
Call themselves Patriot Front. They have ridiculous little uniforms. You might recognize them by their distinctive matching khakis, which is supposed to be menacing instead of making it look like they all just got off work together at Best Buy. But this was them in D.C. last year, trying to intimidate with their little homemade shields and their JV soccer shin guards. This group is a renamed version of one of the white nationalist groups that took part in the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. The group renamed itself after one of its members killed Heather Heyer, a counter-protester, and seriously injured a ton of other people when he deliberately drove his speeding car into a crowd of anti-racist protesters. But them targeting the Pride event in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho this weekend. One of the most unnerving things about the reporting on this was that Patriot Front was apparently not even the only armed far-right group that was targeting that particular Pride event in that particular part of Idaho this weekend. Another so-called Patriot group had planned a show-off-your-gun event to coincide with and menace that same Pride gathering in Coeur d'Alene. The same weekend, a different group of Proud Boys stormed into a library in the San Francisco Bay Area and disrupted a children's story session, shouting anti-gay and anti-trans threats because the story time was led by a drag queen, and so they were there to break it up by force. You will notice that the targets of these various fascist pro-Trump paramilitary groups like Patriot Front, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, you'll notice that their targets are the political targets of our current Republican Party, right? The paramilitary groups are providing physical attacks, physical intimidation to reinforce political attacks. Democrats and deep state actors are trying to steal the election. Well, these will be the groups that'll be the tip of the spear that violently storm into the Capitol to stop that. You know, gay folks and trans folks are going after our children, right? Well, these groups will storm pride festivals and supposedly objectionable children's story groups and menace people with weapons and with threats. They'll put physical force behind the political threats from the Republican Party. There are historical and sociological reasons behind the existence of fascist paramilitary organizations in the United States. This is not our first rodeo with these clowns. But it is a different thing altogether when paramilitary groups like this start playing a political function adjunct to one of the two major parties in our country. That is a very, very bad sign.
Order for Mike.
I didn't order that.
Next.
Satisfaction's not always guaranteed. That's why at Red Carpet Car Wash, we always ask,
Is everything satisfactory?
yes. Thank you for asking.
You missed a spot.
Red Carpet Car Wash. We ask because we care.
we're so used to incompetence, both generally from DC and particularly the Democrats, that it has been astounding to see them put together interesting, tight, intelligent, good, solid hearings, which is just unheard of, especially from the Democratic side. So looking forward to what they have here today. There's talk of eventually trying to get Ginny Thomas to testify because of her role in basically the coup attempt and the riots on January 6th, which is of course the point of these hearings. And Ginny Thomas, of course, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. But that's certainly not going to happen today. I don't want you to get it wrong. So they're coming in now. It's going to start very soon, obviously. When it does, I won't talk much. I don't want you guys to miss anything. I don't want to miss anything. But when they have tiny little bit of breaks or transitions, I'll jump in. And when they excuse me, when they take a bigger break, I'll jump in. And curious to see what witnesses they have today. And guys, I think they're going to get to more and more interesting stuff from my point of view, because look, the video that they had about the cops on the actual day and the slipping in blood, and it was very dramatic. A video of Bill Barr and others saying that what Trump and Clinton was total BS, very dramatic. But I want to get to the actual coup. That's the fake electors. That's the how they were literally trying to steal the election by doing fraud. Those are criminal acts. So a huge percentage of the country now, so 69% say if somebody was caught trying to cheat democracy, they should be arrested. That's great. Unfortunately, a new poll, I just saw the headline. I didn't even get a chance to look at it yet. Covered on the main show maybe today. They're saying that Republicans are better at defending democracy. That's crazy. We'll talk more about that later. Here's Benny Thompson.
Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material represented in today's hearing. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is
You know
almost
what? You need to put this
idea
bet up
un-American
before you play anything.
than the notion that any one person
No, the whole thing needs to be put up.
no idea.
Then he needs to wake up and help you.
I agree with that, which is unusual because former Vice President Mike Pence and I don't agree on much. These are his words, spoken a few months ago about Donald Trump's attempt to pressure the former Vice President, pressure him into going along with an unlawful scheme, overturn the 2020 election, and give Donald Trump a second term in office. He did not win. Today, the Select Committee is going to reveal the details of that pressure campaign. But what does the Vice President of the United States have to do with the presidential election? The Constitution says that the Vice President of the United States oversees the process of counting electoral college votes, the process that took place on January 6, 2021. Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to do something no other vice president has ever done. The former president wanted Pence to reject the votes and either declare Trump the winner or send the votes back to the states to be counted again. Mike Pence said no. He resisted the pressure. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was wrong. We're fortunate for Mr. Pence's courage.
Passing 100 meters. Oxygen efficiency decreased.
Catastrophe. That courage put him in tremendous danger. Mike Pence made it clear that he wouldn't give in to Donald Trump's scheme. Donald Trump turned the mob on him. A mob that was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." A mob that had built a hangman's gallows just outside the Capitol. Thanks in part to Mike Pence, our democracy withstood Donald Trump's scheme and the violence of January 6th. Today we'll lay out the facts for the American people. First, I'll recognize my colleague from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for any opening statement she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me take just a few minutes today to put the topic of our hearing in broader context. In our last hearing, we heard unequivocal testimony. President Trump was told his election fraud allegations were complete nonsense. We heard this from members of the Trump campaign. We heard this from President Trump's campaign lawyers. We heard this from President Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr. We heard this from President Trump's former acting Attorney General, Jeff Rosenberg.
Welcome
And we
aboard,
heard this
Captain.
from President Trump's former acting Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donahue. We heard from members of President Trump's White House staff as well. Today, we're focusing on President Trump's relentless effort to pressure Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes on January 6th. Here again is how the former vice president phrased it in a speech before the Federalist Society, a group of conservative lawyers.
This week, that President Trump said I had the right to overturn the election. President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. And frankly, there is no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president.
What the president wanted the vice president to do was not just wrong, it was illegal and unconstitutional. We will hear many details in today's hearings, but please consider these 2 points. First, President Trump was told repeatedly that Mike Pence lacked the constitutional and legal authority to do what President Trump was demanding he do. This is testimony from Mark Short, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, who served in the Trump administration in multiple positions over 4 years.
But just to pick up on that, Mr. Short, was it your impression that the Vice President had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the President, not just to the world through a dear colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the President?
Very consistent.
Okay.
But President Trump plotted with a lawyer named John Eastman to pressure Pence to do so anyway. As the federal court has explained, quote, based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021.
Seek fluid
What
intake.
exactly did President Trump know? When exactly did President Trump know that it would be illegal for Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes? Here is one sample of testimony given by one of the witnesses before us today, the Vice President's General Counsel.
Did John Eastman ever admit, or, in front of the president, that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count?
I believe he did on the 4th.
That was January 4th, 2 days before the attack on Congress. Second point, please listen to testimony today about all of the ways that President Trump attempted to pressure Vice President Pence, including Donald Trump's tweet at 2:24 p.m. condemning Vice President Mike Pence when President Trump already knew a violent riot was underway at the Capitol. In future hearings, you will hear from witnesses who were present inside the White House, who were present inside the West Wing on that day. But today we focus on the earnest efforts of Mike Pence, who is determined to abide by his oath of office. As Vice President Pence prepared a statement on January 5th,
Vital signs stabilizing.
explaining that he could not illegally refuse to count electoral votes, he said this to his staff.
And the Vice President said this would be the most important thing I ever said. So, this meaning the statement. The statement. And he really wanted to make sure that it was just so.
You will hear today that President Trump's White House counsel believed that the Vice President did exactly the right thing on January 6th, as did others in the White House, as did Fox News host Sean Hannity. Vice President Pence understood that his oath of office was more important than his loyalty to Donald Trump. He did his duty. President Trump unequivocally did not. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Without objection, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, for an opening statement.
And I can even see your faces when you write in this new platform we're using. We love it. Okay, sorry.
January 6th is not an isolated incident. In the weeks culminating before, it was a legal scheme and deception. We've already learned that President Trump knew he lost the 2020 election. Shortly after, he began to look for a way to circumvent our country's most fundamental civic tradition, peaceful transfer of power. The president latched on to a dangerous theory and would not let go because he was convinced it would keep him in office. We witnessed firsthand what happened when the President of the United States weaponized this theory. The Capitol was overrun, police officers lost their lives. And the Vice President was taken to a secure location because his safety was in jeopardy. Let's take a look at the effect of Donald Trump's words and actions. I want to warn our audience that the video contains explicit content.
And I am new at video.
Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now.
I'm telling you what, I'm hearing the Pence. I'm hearing the Pence just caved. No. Is that true? I'm hearing reports that Pence caved. No, I'm telling you, if Pence caved, we're gonna drag motherfuckers through the streets. You fucking politicians are gonna get fucking drugged through the streets. Yes.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here that Pence will decide to do the right thing, according to Trump.
How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where President Trump's most radical supporters led a violent attack on the Capitol and threatened to hang President Trump's own vice president? You'll hear from witnesses that Donald Trump pressured Mike Pence to adopt a legally and morally bankrupt idea that the vice president could choose who the next president can be. You'll hear about how the vice president, the White House counsel, and others told Donald Trump that the vice president had no such authority. But President Trump would not listen. You'll hear how Vice President Pence withstood an onslaught of pressure from President Trump, both publicly and privately. A pressure campaign that built to a fever pitch with a heated phone call on January 6th. You'll also hear that the president knew there was a violent mob at the Capitol when he tweeted at 2:24 p.m. that the vice president did not have the, quote, courage to do what needed to be done. Let me be clear. Vice President Pence did the right thing that day. He stayed true to his oath to protect and defend the Constitution. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I am new
Thank
at
you,
reading.
Mr. Aguilar. We're honored to have two distinguished witnesses who advised Vice President regarding his role on January 6th. Judge J. Michael Ludick is one of the leading conservative legal thinkers in the country. He served in administrations of President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He was appointed by the latter to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, where he served from 1991 to 2006. He provided critical advice for Vice President Pence regarding the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress shortly before that fateful moment. He's written that the vice president does not have the power to select the next president of the United States. He's also written that contrary theory espoused by one of his own former law clerks was, quote, incorrect at every turn. We're also joined today by one of the people who was with Vice President Pence on January 6th. Greg Jacob was counsel to Vice President Pence. He conducted a thorough analysis of the role of Vice President in the joint session of Congress under the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and 230 years of historical practice. But he also has firsthand.
Protect your car from dents, dings, wheel, and windshield damage, dulling headlights, rip stains, and more with Radiant Ride. More than a warranty, it's a cosmetic car care program. In fact, it's the ultimate vehicle appearance experience. A new car is a big investment, and you want to keep it looking new. And that's exactly what Radiant Ride does, with the convenience of your most basic routine maintenance at the dealership. Look, dents and dings are gonna happen. Radiant Ride ensures they don't last. So for the car you want, it's the protection you need. Ask for it by name at the dealership and maintain the value and appearance of your new car with Radiant Ride.
Ready to start eating healthier? Meet Kachava. Kachava is the world's healthiest all-in-one meal shake. A complete meal in seconds to keep you going for hours. It's made with over 70 plant-based superfoods
Welcome
and
aboard,
nutrients,
Captain.
giving you all your essentials in one delicious meal.
Cheers!
Oh, hell yeah.
Oh, that's yummy.
Thank you. With just water, 2 scoops, blend and go. Putting you in control of your nutrition. To improve your well-being. To fuel your body and mind. Only the highest quality plant-based ingredients. Made for health-conscious people on the go. It's a simple change in your daily routine to kickstart a healthier way of life. It's amazing what you can do when you eat healthy and feel your best. Join thousands of happy customers using Kachava to achieve their health goals. It all starts with changing what you put into your body. Click the link and start today.
Information about the Capitol because he was with the vice president and his own life was in danger. I will now swear in our witnesses. The witnesses will please stand and raise their right hand.
Okay, so this is a good moment to make a couple of comments. So Sunflower, thank you for the shout out to Too Strong Coffee. That's why I was putting the mug up. I'm seeing all your comments, and now because of this new platform, I'm seeing the faces on the comments and getting to see you guys. That's awesome. So a lot of you made the point that this sucks that we're having to praise Mike Pence and Liz Cheney, who don't agree with at all. True, but they are doing the right thing here, and it is important.
I now recognize myself for questions. In the United States, people choose our representatives, including the highest official in the land, President of the United States. The American people did this on November 3rd, 2020. President Trump did not like the outcome. He did everything he could to change the result of the election. He tried litigation, 62 cases, and that failed. He tried to pressure state legislatures to reverse the results of the election in their states, but they refused. He tried to enlist the Department of Justice in his efforts to overturn election results, but officials leading the department refused to comply. So eventually, he latched on to a completely nonsensical and anti-democratic theory that one man his own vice president could determine the outcome of the election. He wanted the vice president to unilaterally elect the president. This theory that the vice president could unilaterally select the president runs completely contrary to our Constitution, our laws, and the entirety of our American experience. But that didn't stop. It didn't matter to President Trump. I would now like to explore how President Trump came to latch on to this ridiculous legal theory that the vice president can select the president of the United States. Mr. Jacob, how did this theory first come to your attention?
The first time that I had a conversation with the Vice President about the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act was in early December, around December 7th. The Vice President called me over to his West Wing office and told me that he had been seeing and reading things that suggested that he had a significant role to play on January 6th in announcing the outcome of the election. He told me that he had been first elected to Congress in 2000 and that one of his earliest memories as a congressman was sitting in on the 2001 certification, and he recalled that Al Gore gavelled down a number of rejections that had been raised in Florida. And he asked me mechanically, how does this work at the joint session? I told the Vice President that, in fact, I had a fairly good idea of how things work, that actually there aren't rules to govern the joint session, but what there is
all systems online.
Provision of the Constitution that's just one sentence long, and then an Electoral Count Act that had been passed in 1887. I told the Vice President that I could put a memo together for him overnight that would explain how.
So, Mr. Jacobs, when you looked at this theory, what did you conclude?
So we concluded that what you have is a sentence in the Constitution that is inartfully drafted. But the Vice President's first instinct when he heard this theory was that there was no way that our framers, who abhorred concentrated power, who had broken away from the tyranny of George III, would ever have put one person, particularly not a person who had a direct interest in the outcome because they were on the ticket for the election, in a role to have decisive impact on the outcome of the election. And our review of text, history, and frankly just common sense all confirm the Vice President's first instinct on that point. There is no justifiable basis to conclude that the Vice President has that kind of authority.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. We will hear more today about how, despite this conclusion by you and other top legal advisors, the former president used this discredited theory in his campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the presidential election. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Judge Ludig, thank you as well for being here with us today. You issued a very important statement earlier today, which I urge all Americans to read. And I'd like to ask you, Judge, about one of the sentences in your statement and ask if you could explain to us the significance of it. You say, had the Vice President of the United States obeyed the President of the United States, America would immediately have been plunged into what would have been tantamount to a revolution within a paralyzing constitutional crisis. Could you elaborate on that for us, Judge?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairman. That passage in my statement this morning referenced the most foundational concept in America, which is the rule of law. Thus, as I interpret your question, you were asking about that foundational truth of these United States, which we call America.
Yeah, we do call it America. This guy's super nervous. It's okay, dude. It's okay, just say
The
it.
foundational truth is the rule of law. That foundational truth is, for the United States of America, the profound truth. But it's not merely the profound truth for the United States.
Engine powering up.
It's also the simple truth, the simple foundational truth of the American Republic. Thus, in my view, the hearings being conducted by this select committee are examining that profound truth, namely the rule of law in the United States of America. The specific question, of course, before you and before the nation, not before me, is whether that foundational rule of law was supremely violated on January 6, 2021. Now, the question specifically that you asked,
Thanks, God.
Madam Vice Chair, I believe that had Vice President Pence obeyed the orders from his president, the President of the United States of America, during the joint session of the Congress of the United States on January 6, 2021, and declared Donald Trump the next President of the United States, notwithstanding that then President Trump had lost the Electoral College vote as well as the popular vote in the 2020 presidential election. That declaration of Donald Trump as the next president would have plunged America into what I believe would have been tantamount to a revolution within a constitutional crisis in America, which in my view, and I'm only one man, would have been the first constitutional crisis since the founding of the Republic.
Man, all that to repeat what she said in the beginning. That was like a 20-minute
Thank you
answer. to
very
say,
much, Judge,
Red is clean.
for your solemn attention to these issues and for your appearance here today. We're going to describe and discuss in detail what happened. And as we do, I'm going to describe a few of the details now of some of the actions taken by a gentleman named Kenneth Cheeseborough. After the Electoral College met and cast their votes on December 14th, actually the day before they met, Kenneth Cheeseborough sent a memo to Rudy Giuliani, the president's lead outside counsel. Mr. Cheeseborough wrote to Mayor Giuliani that the vice president is charged with, quote, making judgments about what to do if there are conflicting votes, close quote. Mr. Cheeseborough wrote that when the joint session of Congress got to Arizona in the alphabetical list of states, the vice president should not count the Biden votes, quote, because there are two slates of votes. His justification, which we will learn more about in our next hearing, was that a group of Trump supporters in Arizona and other swing states decided to proclaim themselves the true electors for the state, creating two sets of electors, the official electors selected by the state and a group of fake electors. This document was ordered to be produced to the Select Committee by a federal district court judge. As you will see on the screen shortly, Judge David Carter wrote, quote, the draft memo pushed a strategy that knowingly violated the Electoral Count Act. The judge concluded that, quote, the memo is both intimately related to and clearly advanced the plan to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. A few days later, Professor John Eastman took up this cause. Eastman was at the time a law professor at Chapman University Law School. He prepared a memo outlining the nonsensical theory that the vice president could decide the outcome of the election at the joint session of Congress on January 6th. You will see portions of this memo on the screen. In the first line, he wrote, quote, 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the President of the Senate. But Dr. Eastman goes on to rely on those so-called dual slates of electors to say that Vice President Pence could simply declare President Trump winner of the 2020 election. Mr. Jacob, were there in fact dual slates of electors from 7 states?
No, there were not.
And just a few days after that, Dr. Eastman wrote another memo. This one, quote, wargaming out several scenarios.
Powering down.
He knew the outcome he wanted, and he saw a way to go forward if he simply pretended that fake electors were real. You will see that memo up on the screen now. Here, Dr. Eastman says the Vice President would reject Biden electors in the states that he calls, quote, disputed. Under several of the scenarios, the Vice President could ultimately just declare Donald Trump the winner, regardless of the vote totals that had already been certified by the states. However, this was false, and Dr. Eastman knew it was false. In other words, it was a lie. In fact, on December 19th, 2020, just 4 days before Dr. Eastman sent this memo, Dr. Eastman himself admitted in an email that the fake electors had no legal weight, referring to the fake electors as, quote, dead on arrival in Congress.
Integrating new PDA
end
data.
Quote, because they did not have a certification from their states.
Signatures on the island's
Judge
surface.
Ludig, did the Trump electors in those 7 states who were not certified by any state authority have any legal significance?
Here comes 20 minutes to say yes. And no, they did not have legal significance. In the United States of America, they, on this day or any other day,
Congresswoman, there was
do not.
no support whatsoever in either the Constitution of the United States nor the laws of the United States or the Vice President frankly, ever count alternative electoral slates from the states that had not been officially certified by the designated state official in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I did notice in a passage from Mr. Eastman's memorandum, and I took a note on it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he said in that passage that there was both legal authority as well as historical precedent. I do know what Mr. Eastman was referring to when he said that there was historical precedent for doing so. He was incorrect. There was no historical precedent from the beginning of the founding in 1789.
Always the unnecessary dates.
That even as mere historical precedent, as distinguished from legal precedent,
Lots of parentheses.
would support
You see my brother with the goat beard?
possibility of the Vice President of the United States quote, counting alternative electoral slates that had not been officially certified to the Congress pursuant to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I'd be glad to explain that historical precedent if the committee wanted, but it would...
No, please don't ask him to explain it.
Thank you very much, Judge. I
But we
know
are-
my colleagues will
wrong
be
here.
pursuing that issue in more depth. And now I'd like to yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Substantively, we're at the very
Pursuant
epicenter
to
of what was
Section
wrong
5C8
legally. So this is really good stuff.
503. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Aguilar, and staff counsel, Mr. John Wood. Question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're fortunate to have a bipartisan staff. Senior Investigative Counsel John Wood previously served as United States Attorney in Missouri under President George W. Bush. He and I will share today's lines of questioning. Mr. Wood?
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. Judge Ludig, I had the incredible honor of serving as one of your law clerks. Another person who did was John Eastman. And you have written that Dr. Eastman's theory that the vice president could determine who the next president of the United States is, in your words, incorrect at every turn. Could you please explain briefly your analysis?
Uh-oh. He takes so long in the windup, too. You see the guy in the mauve shirt with the long beard? I can't stop looking at him every time they show the photographer.
New blueprint acquired.
I could answer that question.
Please do.
Integrating new PDA data.
At my disposal, either Mr. Eastman's tweet or my own analytical tweet of September 21st, but I don't. But that said, let me try to remember the analysis of Mr. Eastman's analysis.
And Judge, I can read to you and to the audience, I think what was a really key passage from your very insightful analysis. wrote, I believe that Professor Eastman was incorrect at every turn of the analysis, his January 2nd memorandum, beginning with his claim that there were legitimate competing slates of electors represented from 7 states. You've already addressed that issue. But your next sentence said, continuing to his conclusion, the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from the 7 states from which competing slates were allegedly presented. So what was your basis for concluding that Dr. Eastman was incorrect in his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes?
As I previously stated in response to Congresswoman Cheney,
Don't repeat, please. It'll take 20 minutes.
there was no basis in the
Systems online.
of the United States at all for the theory espoused by Mr. Eastman. At all. None. With all respect to my co-panelist, he said, I believe in partial response to one of the Select Committee's questions,
All systems online.
Was, he thought, inartfully written. That single sentence is not inartfully written. It was crystalline clear.
Drums.
That the President of the Senate on January 6th, the incumbent Vice President of the United States, had little substantive constitutional authority, if any, at all. The 12th Amendment, a single sentence that Mr. Jacob refers to, says in substance that following the transmission of the certificates to the Congress of the United States and under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, the Archivist of the United States, that the presiding officer shall open the certificates in the presence
New
of
blueprint
the Congress
acquired.
of the United States in joint session.
I've lost years of my life between his pauses.
It then says unmistakably, not even that the Vice President himself shall count the electoral votes. It clearly says merely that the electoral count votes shall then be counted. It was the Electoral Count Act of 1887 that that filled in, if you will, the simple words of the 12th Amendment in order to instruct
Welcome aboard,
the
Captain.
country a process for the counting of the sacred process for the counting of the electoral votes from the states, that neither our original Constitution or even the 12th Amendment had done.
These are important points that are getting
irony,
lost
if
in how
you
he's
will,
telling the story.
is that from its founding until 1887, when Congress passed the Electoral Count Act, the nation had been in considerable turmoil.
Oh, he's going into a history lesson. Please don't, brother. Please don't.
At least 5 of its presidential elections, beginning as soon thereafter from the founding as 1800. So it wasn't almost 100 years later until. So
all systems online.
That piece of legislation is not only a work in progress, but at this moment in history,
picking up speed,
an important work in progress that was long-winded, I understand.
You're correct. Your testimony.
At the risk of oversimplifying for the non-lawyers who are watching, is it fair to say that the 12th Amendment basically says two things happen? The Vice President opens the certificates and the electoral votes are counted. Is it that straightforward?
Please say yes. Please say yes. What is the big pause?
I
That's
would
what.
not want that to be my testimony before Congress of the United States. The language of the 12th Amendment is that simple.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Jacob, I have a question for you. I believe during your deposition before this committee, you said something to the effect of you'd read every word written about the 12th Amendment, the Electoral Count Act, and historical practice. I know in response to the chairman's earlier question, you gave your bottom line conclusion, but can you tell us a little bit about the process that you and your colleagues went through of researching this issue and what conclusion you came to after your thorough research?
Oh boy.
So,
oh, it's the other guy. Okay.
you, as a lawyer who's analyzing a constitutional provision, you start with the constitutional text, you go to structure, you go to history. So we started with the text. We did not think that the text was quite as unambiguous as Judge Ludig indicated. In part, we had a constitutional crisis in 1876 because in that year, multiple slates of electors were certified by multiple slates. And when it came time to count those votes, the antecedent question of which ones had to be answered. That required the appointment of an independent commission. That commission had to resolve that question, and the purpose of the Electoral Count Act
integrating new PDA data
had been to resolve those latent ambiguities. Now, I'm in complete agreement with Judge Ludig. It is unambiguous that the Vice President does not have the authority to reject electors. There is no suggestion of any kind that it does. There is no mention of rejecting or objecting to electors anywhere in the 12th Amendment. And so the notion that the Vice President could do that certainly is not in the text. But the problem that we had and that John Eastman raised in our discussions was we had all seen that in Congress in 2000, in 2004, in 2016, there had been objections raised in various states. And those had even been debated in 2004. And so here you have an amendment that says nothing about objecting or rejecting, and yet we did have some recent practice of that happening within the terms of the Electoral Count. So we started with that text, and I recall in my discussion with the Vice President, he said,
integrating
I
new
can't wait to go
PDA
ahead
data
and meet the framers and tell them the work that you did in putting together our Constitution is a work of genius. Thank you. It was divinely inspired. There is one sentence that I would like to talk to you a little bit about. So then we went to structure. And again, the vice president's first instinct here is so decisive on this question. There's just no way that the framers of the Constitution, who divided power and authority, who separated it out, who had broken away from George III and declared him to be a tyrant, there was no way that they would have given one person the authority to determine who was going to be president of the United States. Then we went to history.
Integrating
We
new
examined
PDA
every
data.
single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. We examined the Electoral Count Act. We
New
examined
blueprint
practice under the
acquired.
Electoral Count. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority, hadn't claimed authority to reject electoral votes, had not claimed authority to return electoral votes back to the states. In the entire history of the United States, not once had a joint session ever returned electoral votes back to the states to be counted. And in the crisis of 1876,
Signal location
Justice
uploaded to
Bradley,
PDA.
Of the United States Supreme Court, who supplied the decisive final vote,
Integrating new
had
PDA
specifically
data.
looked at that question and said, first, the Vice President clearly doesn't have authority to decide anything. And by the way, also does not have authority to conduct an investigation by sending things back out for a public look at. So the history was absolutely decisive. And again, part of my discussion with Mr. Eastman was, if you were right, don't you think Al Gore might have liked to have known in 2000 that he had authority to just declare himself president of the United States? Do you think that the Democrat lawyers just didn't think of this very obvious quirk that he could use to do that? And of course, he acknowledged Al Gore did not and should not have had that authority at that point. But so, text, structure, history, I think what we had was some ambiguous text that common sense and structure would tell you the answer cannot possibly be the vice president has that authority. As the committee already played the vice president's remarks, there is almost no idea more un-American than the notion of any one person to choose an American president. And then unbroken historical practice for 230 years that the vice president did not have such.
Then Kamala Harris could pick Joe Biden as the next president next election.
Jacob, you weren't
Somebody
the only
make
one
the Kamala Harris
who
point.
knew that the legal theory was wrong, though. Here's what various advisors to the president thought about that theory.
You've been clear repeatedly, Mr. Meadows, about the Vice President having a different view about his authority as
Captain.
Did Mr. Meadows ever
Systems online.
explicitly or tacitly agree with you, or say, yeah, that makes sense, okay?
I believe that that Mark did agree.
What makes you say that?
I believe that's what he told me. But as I mentioned, I think Mark had told so many people so many different things that it was not something that that I would necessarily accept as, okay, well, that means that's resolved.
I see. Tell me more what he told you on this topic.
Well, I think it was that, the vice president doesn't have any broader role. And I think he was understanding of that.
So despite the fact that he may have said other things to the president or others, to you, he said he understands the vice president has no role.
Yes.
Okay. Did he say that to you several times?
A couple of times.
Before January 6th?
The way it was communicated to me was that Pastor Baloney thought the idea was nutty and had at what point confronted Eastman basically with the same sentiment.
Pat expressed his admiration for the vice president's actions on the day of the 6th and said that he concurred with the legal analysis that our team had put together to reach that point.
It made no sense to me that in all the protections that were built into the Constitution for a president to get elected and steps that have to be taken, that the power to choose the next president would be sitting with the vice president.
Do you know if Mr. Clark or Mr. Morgan thought about that, Mr. Eastman's advice?
Yeah, they thought he was crazy.
Do you know if they ever expressed an opinion on whether they thought the vice president had the power that John Eastman said he did?
I know for a fact I heard both say that his theory was crazy, that there was no validity to it in any way, shape, or form.
And did they express that before January 6th?
Yes.
To whom?
I think anyone who would listen.
Okay, what were your prior interactions with Eastman?
He described for me what he thought the ambiguity was in the statute, and he was walking through it at that time. And I said, hold on a second, I want to understand what you're saying. You're saying that you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And he said yes. I said, are you out of your effing mind?
Passing 100 meters. Oxygen efficiency decreased.
This guy's my favorite.
Passing 200
You're going to turn around.
Oxygen efficiency greatly decreased.
78+ million people in this country that your theory is this is how you're going to invalidate their votes because you think the election was stolen. And they're not going to tolerate that. So you're going to cause riots. And he said, worst effect of there's been violence in the history of our country.
Eric Hirsch is my favorite.
In
I
fact,
love that guy.
there was a
Listen,
risk
Matt in the
that
background.
lawyers
That's
in the White House counsel's office would resign. For example, Fox News host Sean Hannity expressed concern that the entire White House counsel's office could quit. As you can see from these texts, Mr. Hannity wrote to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that, quote, "We can't lose the entire White House counsel's office. I do not see January 6th happening the way he is being told." A few days later, on January 5th, Mr. Hannity wrote to Mr. Meadows that, quote, "I'm very worried the next 48 hours. Pence pressure, White House counsel will leave." While Sean Hannity was apparently very concerned about the possibility that the White House counsel would resign in protest of the president's effort to force the vice president to violate the Constitution, some others close to the president were more dismissive of the White House counsel's position. Here's what Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner said during his deposition regarding the White House counsel Pat Cipollone's threats to resign.
Jared, are you aware of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to resign?
I kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done. And I know that, he was always, him and the team were always saying, oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if this happens, if that happens. So I kind of took it up to just be whining, to be honest with you.
Wow.
The president's own lead outside counsel, Rudy Giuliani, also seemed to concede that the vice president did not have the authority to decide the outcome of the election or send it back to the states. Here's what White House attorney Eric Hirschman said about his call with Mayor Giuliani on the morning of the 6th.
The morning of January 6th, I think he called me out of the blue, right? And I was like getting dressed. And we had an intellectual discussion about Eastman's, I don't know if it's Eastman's theory per se, but the VP's role. And he was asking me my view and analysis and then the practical implications of it. And when we finished, he said, like, I believe that, you're probably right. I think he thought when we're done that it would be something he'd have to consider if he was sitting on the bench, but he'd probably come down in that, you couldn't interpret it or sustain the argument long term.
Of course, the fact that Mayor Giuliani seemed to admit that the theory was wrong did not stop him from going before the crowd just a few hours later on January 6th and saying the exact opposite. Here's Mayor Giuliani's speech at the Ellipse rally on January 6th.
We're here just very briefly to make a very important 2 points. Number one, every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal, I have Professor Eastman here with me to say a few words about that. He's one of the preeminent constitutional scholars in the United States.
No, he isn't.
It is perfectly appropriate, given the questionable constitutionality of the Election Counting Act of 1887, that the vice president can cast it aside, and he can do what a president called Jefferson did when he was vice president. He can decide on the validity of these crooked ballots, or he can send it back to the legislatures, give them 5 to 10 days to finally finish the work.
And here's what Dr. Eastman said in his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
Even Dr. Eastman knew his theory didn't hold water. Mr. Jacob, you discussed and even debated this theory at length with Dr. Eastman. Did Dr. Eastman ever tell you what he thought the U.S. Supreme Court would do if it had to decide this issue?
Yes. We had an extended discussion, an hour and a half to 2 hours on January 5th. And when I pressed him on the point, I said, John, if the vice president did what you were asking him to do, we would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court, wouldn't we? And he initially started it, well, I think maybe you would lose only 7-2. And after some further discussion, acknowledged, well, yeah, you're right, we would lose 9-0.
I appreciate that. In our investigation, the Select Committee has obtained evidence suggesting that Dr. Eastman never really believed his own theory. Let me explain. On the screen, you can see a draft letter to the president from October 2020. In this letter, an idea was proposed that the vice president could determine which electors to count at the joint session of Congress. But the person writing in blue eviscerates that argument. The person who wrote the comments in blue wrote, quote, the 12th Amendment only says that the president of the Senate opens the ballots in the joint session and then, in the passive voice, that the votes shall then be counted. The comments in blue further state, nowhere does it suggest that the president of the Senate gets to make the determination on his own. Judge Ludig, does it surprise you that the author of those comments in blue was in fact John Eastman?
Uh-oh, here we go. It shouldn't surprise you, but it does, or something like it could be quick and easy answer, but we won't have it. The frowns of the ladies in the background are amazing, by the way.
Watching this unfold, let me try to unpack what was at the root of what I have called the blueprint to overturn the 2020 election.
Uh-oh, we're unpacking a root. This could take a while.
And I had foreshadowed this answer in my earlier testimony to Congresswoman Cheney. Mr. Eastman, from the beginning, said to the president that there was both legal as well as historical precedent for the vice president to overturn the election. And what we've heard today, I believe, is what happened within the White House and elsewhere as all the players led by Mr. Eastman got wrapped around the axle by the historical evidence claim by Mr. Eastman.
The reason Ludig is here is because he's Federalist Society. Deep right-winger. Deep.
This is what I said would require a digression that I would be glad to undertake if you wished.
No digression.
In short, if I had been advising the Vice President of the United States on January 6th, and even if then Vice President Jefferson and even then Vice President John Adams and even then Vice President Richard Nixon
Okay, don't list all the vice presidents, please.
had done exactly what the President of the United States wanted his Vice President to do. I would have laid my body across the road before I would have let the Vice President overturn the 2020 election on the basis of that historical precedent. But what this body needs to know, and now America needs to know, is that that was the centerpiece of the plan to overturn the 2020 election. It was the historical precedent in the years and with the vice presidents that I named, as Congressman Raskin understands well. And the effort by Mr. Eastman and others was to drive that historical precedent up to and under that single sentence, single pristine sentence in the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution, taking advantage of, if you will, what many have said is the inartful wording of that sentence in the 12th Amendment. Scholars before 2020 would have used that historical precedent to argue not that Vice President Pence could overturn the 2020 election by accepting non-certified state electoral votes.
He thinks he's being serious.
Would have made as to some substantive, not merely procedural, authority possessed by the Vice President of the United States on the statutorily prescribed day for counting the Electoral College votes.
No, he's just saying it in a confusing way and way too long in pauses. For God's sake, dude, get to the point.
Judge, I think that's a good point, and I think it kind of begs the question that if the vice president had this power to determine the outcome of a presidential election, why hasn't it ever been used before? Why hasn't that ever happened? Why hasn't a vice president simply rejected the outcome of an election and declared someone else the winner?
Right, they were saying
Instead,
earlier
as
about
the chairman
how
mentioned in his opening,
Gore
for over 2 centuries,
just
vice
as easily
presidents
done what they
presided
did and
over the
been
joint
like, okay,
sessions
well,
of
I'm
Congress
president,
in a purely
know.
ceremonial role.
Because we all saw it fucking
This
happen.
even includes,
Electoral
as
College
Mr.
picked
Jacob
what we
mentioned,
did not pick.
Vice President Al Gore.
So fuck that.
Those of us who are
We
old
saw it
enough to
happen then. We
remember,
saw it happen a
the
couple
2000
times after that,
election
I think.
came
I know
down
with Trump
to
we did.
one state.
Because he actually
Dude, he
lost.
never actually won an
Weeks
election.
of
He wasn't
recounts and
gonna win.
litigation
Hillary dropped
after
out
the
for some
election.
reason.
Because she's too good.
Of course, Al Gore
She's
was
too
vice
good.
president at the
And
time.
she was like, well,
He
I
never
can't
suggested that he
create
could
a
simply declare
constitutional
himself
crisis
the
on
winner
my
of the
behalf.
2000
I
election.
think they already knew it was
over
going to
the
happen.
counting of the electoral votes.
And they
Let's hear what
convinced her
Vice
to
President
back
Gore
off.
said when he described the situation he faced in 2000.
Importance of the United States of America in all of human history. In Lincoln's phrase, we still are the last best hope of humankind.
I know.
And the choice between one's own disappointment in your personal career and upholding the noble traditions of America's democracy is a pretty easy choice when it comes down to it.
Mr. Jacob, did Dr. Eastman say whether he would want other vice presidents such as Al Gore after the 2000 election or Kamala Harris after the 2024 election to have the power to decide the outcome of the election?
So this was one of the many points that we discussed on January 5th. He had come into that meeting trying to persuade us that there was some validity to his theory. I viewed it as my objective to persuade him to acknowledge he was just wrong. And I thought this had to be one of the most powerful arguments. I mean, John, back in 2000, you weren't jumping up and saying Al Gore had this authority to do that. You would not want Kamala Harris to be able to exercise that kind of authority in 2024 when I hope Republicans will win the election. And I know you hope that too, John. And he said, absolutely. Al Gore did not have a basis to do it in 2000. Kamala Harris shouldn't be able to do it in 2024, but I think you should do it today.
But I think you should do it today.
Mark Short told the
I love how they're
Select
just
Committee
like,
that
yeah,
Vice
it's okay if
President
we do
Pence consulted
things,
with one of
but
his
you know,
predecessors,
you guys
Vice
can't or
President
shouldn't
Dan
do
Quayle,
things because they'll look
regarding
bad
the
or
role of the Vice
you know.
President. Vice President Quayle confirmed Pence's view that the role was purely ceremonial. Mr. Short also told the committee that he, Mr. Short, received a call from former House Speaker Paul Ryan. Here is
Trump
Mr.
does
Short's
need to be
description
locked up.
of his conversation with
I know,
Speaker
I
Ryan.
did.
You gotta tell me when you do that, babe. Just out of consideration, you know?
Okay. I'm gonna try to leave it on for a minute.
Fortunately, for the fate of our republic, Vice President Pence refused to go along with President Trump's demand.
I should have like a
to
nice
determine the
red,
outcome of the
big red
presidential
sign
election.
that says on air.
Mr. Jacob, what was the Vice
That way I
President's
can
reaction when you discussed with
turn
him
it
the
on
theory that the
whenever,
Vice President could
whenever the
decide the
microphone
outcome
is
of the election?
broadcasting.
Congressman, as I testified, the Vice President's first instinct was that there was no way that any one person, particularly the Vice President, who is on the ticket and has a vested outcome in the election, possibly have the authority to.
Yeah, the fact that they knew
Decide
that they
it
didn't
by
want
rejecting
Democrats to do it, but they were going to do
or
it themselves, that's the
decisively
fucking
alter
coup,
the
man. They knew it.
by
They knew it.
suspending the joint session for the first time in history. in order
Crazy to
try
think
get
Pence
a
saved the Republic.
Despite the fact that the Vice
I would say
President
those
had a
cops
strongly held
saved
and
it a lot
correct
more
view
than Pence
that he
did.
could not decide the outcome of the election, President Trump launched a multi-week campaign.
Pence was
of
flip-flopping
both
on
public
the issue.
and private pressure to get the Vice President Mike Pence to violate the Constitution. Here are some examples of the intense pressure the Vice President faced from all sides and what his Chief of Staff thought of it.
I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great Vice President comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Was it your impression that the Vice President had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the President, not just to the world,
I already automated message from Aurora Live Pod 13.
He had to like ask other people what they would do first. Like, hey, how about already knowing that the Republic and the people come first, not you, not your team, not your Republican Party, or any political
feel that this is going to be a climactic
Like the fact
battle?
alone that he had
I
to
think
ask
a lot of that depends
for
on the courage
directions
and the spine of the individuals
or
involved.
ask
That'd be a
input,
nice way
like
to
he
say
literally went
a guy
and
named
asked
Mike,
people.
Vice President Mike Pence.
What would you do? Well, fuck, man. If you have to ask, maybe you shouldn't be in that position in the first place.
The president, I think I think they're part of this.
I think the vice president is going to throw down.
Yeah, this person.
Do the right thing because, like I said before, this is a time.
This person
for
says
choosing.
they were
People are
hypocrites
gonna
on the
look back
Supreme
at this
Court
vote
nomination. Of
tomorrow
course, they would be
and
hypocrites on the
every
powers of the
single
VP,
one of their
right?
elected
As
officials
soon as it
they vote
as soon
for
as
the
it
rule of law, they
values
vote
them to
election
do something,
right,
they'll do it.
they give it
And then
away
as soon
to
as it
Democrats
values
who cheated
them
and stole
to
their
tell
way
the other
through this
side not to
election.
do it, they will.
Definitely
They always do this. They always do this. And there's enough right-wingers in the Democratic Party at this point that, you know, if half the Democratic Party is right-wingers and they're like, oh, you know what, that sounds like good advice, we should not do anything. And then there's gridlock on the left because we've got a bunch of right-wingers that are infiltrating the party and then being like, well, you know, they do make a lot of sense. Well, go back to that side then.
For example,
Go back to that side if that makes sense, because you know what? The left is the left for a reason. And they keep trying to grab the progressives and pull them to the right, and it's just, no. I'm sorry.
Trump retweeted a memo from an individual named Ivan
It doesn't work
Reitman
that way.
entitled
That's why
Operation Pence Card.
the numbers are the way they are for Biden, because he's doing exactly that. He's listening to Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema,
President Trump
and he is
started
pulling
his
us,
pressure
kicking and
campaign in
screaming
December.
over to the right wing,
He dialed up the pressure.
locking in
January 6th approach.
and cementing shit that they have done for the past decades.
The testimony
And
we've received
it's
in
just-
our investigation indicates that by the
it's really
time
sad.
January 4th
Really
arrived,
sad.
President Trump had already engaged in a quote multi-week campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the election. This had included private conversations between the two leaders,
Blissfully
tweets,
unaware. You're right.
at least one meeting with members of Congress. We understand that the vice president started his day on January 4th with a rally in Georgia for the Republican candidates in the U.S. Senate runoff. When the vice president
I
returned
mean, it
to
affects
Washington,
everybody on
he was
such a
summoned to
level.
meet with the president regarding the upcoming joint session of Congress.
Man, I'm gonna have to
Mr. Jacob,
move this
you
thing.
attended that meeting?
This is super
The
effective.
attendees were the vice president, Mark Short, the chief of staff to the vice president, myself, John Eastman. There was about a 5-minute period where Mark Meadows came in on a different issue.
You got Brown Lady in the background, and John McLaughlin's the younger brother.
Meeting between the president and the vice president. What theories did Dr. Eastman present regarding the role of the vice president in counting the electoral votes?
During the meeting on January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were two legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise 2 days later on January 6th. One of them was that he could reject electoral votes outright. The other was that he could use his capacity as presiding officer to suspend the proceedings and declare essentially a 10-day recess during which states that he deemed to be disputed, there was a list of 5 to 7 states that the exact number changed from conversation to conversation, but that the vice president could issue a demand to the state legislatures in those states to re-examine the election and declare who had won each of those states. So he said that both of those were legally viable options. He said that he did not recommend, upon questioning, he did not recommend what he called the more aggressive option, which was reject outright, because he thought that that would be less politically palatable. The imprimatur of state legislature authority would be necessary to ultimately have public acceptance of an outcome in favor of President Trump, and so he advocated that the preferred course of action would be the procedural route of suspending the joint session and sending the election back to the states.
Mr. Jacob, I know you won't discuss the direct conversations between the president and the vice president, so rather than asking you what the vice president said in that meeting, I'll ask you a more general question. Did the Vice President ever waver in his position that he could not unilaterally decide which electors to accept?
The Vice President never budged from the position that I had described as his first instinct, which was that it just made no sense. Everything he knew and studied about our Constitution, that one person would have that claim.
Did the Vice President ever waver in his position that he could not delay certification and send it back to the states?
No, he did not.
Did Dr. Eastman admit in front of the President that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
Do something with
So
it?
during that meeting on the 4th, I think
Bioenergy
raised the problem that both of Mr. Eastman's proposals would violate several provisions of the Electoral Count Act. Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case, that even though he is the more politically palatable option would violate several provisions, but he thought we could do so because in his view the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional.
Welcome aboard, Captain.
All
All systems online.
His view was that the court simply wouldn't get involved. They would invoke political question doctrine, and therefore we could have some comfort proceeding with that matter.
Mr. Wood?
Yeah, they're definitely lining up for Mike Pence to try to run in 2024.
He told you at some point that if, in fact, the issue ever got to the Supreme Court, his theory would lose 9-0, correct?
Like a demonic groaning.
The next morning,
Yeah.
Starting around
It's
11
This
or
game is
11:30,
scary.
we met for
It
an hour
can
and a
be.
half to 2 hours.
It can be.
In that meeting,
Because you don't always know what's
Barney
around you.
described the text, structure, history conversation.
Oh,
We started
Half-Life
walking through all
creeps
of
me
that.
out too.
Said, John, basically what you have is some text that may be a little bit ambiguous, but then nothing else that would support it, including the fact that nobody would ever want that to be the rule. Wouldn't we lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court? Again, he initially started, well, maybe you'd only lose 7-2, but ultimately acknowledged that no, we would lose 9-0. No judge would support his argument.
After his meeting with the Vice President, Donald Trump flew to Georgia for a rally in support of the Republican candidates in the United States Senate runoff. Even though the Vice President had been steadfast in resisting the President's pressure, President Trump continued to publicly pressure Vice President Pence in his Georgia speech. Rather than focusing exclusively on the Georgia Senate runoff, Trump turned his attention to Mike Pence. Here's what the President said during that rally in Georgia.
I was up on top of the...
Pence comes through for us.
I was on top of the damn thing.
I hope that our great Vice President comes through for us. He's a great guy.
That freaked me out, man.
Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him
on
quite as
top
much.
of the thing, and I fell off.
So the President had been told multiple times that the Vice President could not affect the outcome of the election, but he nonetheless publicly pressured Mike Pence to do exactly that.
Because this is on
by saying,
hardcore,
quote,
so I mean, if I
"If he
die,
doesn't come
man,
through,
I'm dead.
I won't like him as much." Let's turn now to January 5th. Mr. Wood?
Thank you. That morning, meaning January 5th, the President issued a tweet expressly stating that the Vice President had the power to reject electors. Let's look at what the President wrote. Quote, "The Vice President has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors." Mr. Jacob, you've already told us about your meeting with Dr. Eastman and the President on January 4th, and you briefly made reference to the meeting you had with Dr. Eastman the next day, January 5th. Can you tell us a little bit more about that meeting with Dr. Eastman on January 5th? For example, where was the meeting? Who was there?
So at the conclusion of the meeting on the 4th, the President asked that our office meet with Mr. Eastman the next day to hear more about the positions he had expressed at that meeting, and the Vice President indicated that offered me up as his counsel to fulfill that duty. So we met in Mark Short's office in the Executive Office Building across the way from the White House. Dr. Eastman had
Where? Very east
court hearing
mine.
by Zoom that morning, so didn't start first thing, but rather started around 11. And that meeting went for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Chief of Staff Mark Short was at that meeting most of the time. There were a few times that he left. Essentially, it was an extended discussion. What most surprised me about that meeting was that when Mr. Eastman came in, he said, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors." So on the 4th, that had been the path that he had said, "I'm not recommending that you do that." But on the 5th, he came in and expressly requested that. And I grabbed a notebook as I was heading into the meeting.
Dude,
I
where
didn't
did
hear
my
much new from him to
Seamoth go?
record, but that was the first thing I recorded in my notes was a request that the VP reject.
Just to be clear, you're saying that Dr. Eastman
Dude,
urged
my
the Vice
Seamoth
President
got
to adopt
ate
the
up
very same
just
approach
now.
that Dr. Eastman appeared to abandon in the Oval Office meeting with the President the day before. Is that correct?
Sometimes this
He
game
had
really
recommended
sucks.
against it the evening before, and then on the 5th, came in and I think it was probably his first words after introductions and as we sat down were, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors in the disputed states."
And you referenced a moment ago some
Make a
handwritten
new
notes which you
Seamoth.
provided to the Select Committee. I'd now like to show you those notes.
Or hope it comes back.
John Wood's also a Republican.
As you can see, you wrote there at the top, the writing's a little bit faint in the copy, but you wrote, "Requesting VP reject." Does that accurately reflect what Dr. Eastman asked of you in your meeting on January 5th?
Yes.
And what was your reaction when Dr. Eastman said on January 5th that he was there to ask the Vice President of the United States to reject electors at the joint session of Congress?
I was surprised because I had viewed it as one of the key concessions that we had secured the night before, Mr. Eastman, that he was not recommending that we do that.
So what did you say to him?
Well, as I indicated, to some extent it simplified my task because there are more procedural complexities to the send it back to the states point of view, and I actually had spent most of my evening the night before writing a memorandum to the Vice President explaining all of the specific provisions of the Electoral Count Act that plan would violate. So instead, since he was pushing the sort of robust unilateral power theory, I've already walked the committee through the discussions that we had. Again, I started out with our points of commonality, or what I thought were our points of commonality. We're conservatives, we're small government people, we believe in originalism as the means by which we're going to interpret this. So we walked through the text, we walked through the history. That the committee had shown footage of Mr. Eastman on the stage on the 6th claiming that Jefferson supported his position in a historical example of Jefferson. In fact, he conceded in that meeting Jefferson did not at all support his position, that in the election of 1800, there had been some small technical defect with the certificate in Georgia. It was absolutely undisputed that Jefferson had won Georgia. Jefferson did not assert that he had any authority to reject electors. He did not assert that he had any authority to resolve any issue during the course of that. And so he acknowledged by the end that there was no historical practice whatsoever.
Oh my god, come on now.
Uh-oh.
This thing is glitching the fuck out.
Okay, let's hope this doesn't create an issue here. This is really good stuff. They're doing a really, really great job of laying out the case here.
At Wayfair, there are millions of Wayfair.
There's Wayfair. That's happening. Okay, so look, Ludic's been a disaster. His answers are so long and so elliptical and vague, and so he has not been helpful. But remember, he's a huge Federalist and a huge right-winger. So if a lot of you are wondering, like, why are they making, like, framing Pence as the hero and stuff?
things, if the courts did not step in to resolve this, there was nobody else to resolve it. You would be in a situation where you have a standoff between the President of the United States and, counterfactually, the Vice President of the United States, saying that we've exercised authorities constitutionally we think we have, by which we have deemed ourselves the winners of the election. You would have an opposed House and Senate disagreeing with that. You would have state legislatures that, to that point, I mean, Republican leaders across those legislatures had put out statements, and we collected these for the Vice President as well, that the people had spoken in their states and that they had no intention of reversing the outcome of the election. We did receive some signed letters that Mr. Eastman forwarded us by minorities of leaders in those states, but no state had any legislative house that indicated that it had any interest in it. So you would have had just an unprecedented constitutional jump ball situation with that standoff. And as I expressed to him, that issue might well then have to be decided in the streets. Because if we can't work it out politically, we've already seen how charged up people are about this election. And so it would be a disastrous situation to be in. So I said, I think the courts will intervene. I do not see a commitment in the Constitution of the question whether the Vice President has that authority to some other actor to resolve. There's arguments about whether Congress and the Vice President jointly have a constitutional commitment to generally decide electoral vote issues. I don't think that they have any authority to object or reject them. I don't see it in the 12th Amendment, nonetheless. And I concluded by saying, John, in light of everything that we've discussed, can't we just both agree that this is a terrible idea? And he couldn't quite bring himself to say yes to that, but he very clearly said, well, yeah, I see we're not going to be able to persuade you. And that was how the meeting went.
You just described a terrifying scenario. Sounds like there could have been chaos under the Eastman approach. You even described it as it potentially could be decided in the streets. And you described several concessions that Dr. Eastman made throughout that discussion or even debate that you had with him. At some point during that meeting on January 5th, Dr. Eastman seemed to admit that both of the theories that he had presented to the United States the day before. So, the theory that the Vice President could reject electors outright and declare Donald Trump the winner, and his less aggressive theory.
A lot of those are benign.
The Vice President could simply
it's the ones
back to the states.
Yeah,
At some point in
that's
that
what you're
conversation
hearing.
on the 5th, did Dr. Eastman
The ones that are
those
shrill
of
and
these
high pitched,
theories
those are the ones you have to
suffered
worry
from
about.
similar
Because that
legal
means something
flaws?
is about to bite you.
I think if I saw the creature
I
so
had
the noise, I would
at
be
least
scared.
one.
Well, I mean, it's too far away for me to really show you. They're up there, though, I believe,
In
somewhere.
the earlier meeting, we really were focused because his request that he made had been reject the electors outright.
Oh, I hate caves,
Why
man.
that theory was
Especially when you get deeper down, because there's a lot of nasty shit in the caves.
later that day, pivoted back to, well,
But I've already
hear you
put a
loud
lot
and
of
clear,
resources
you're not going
in,
to
so I need to
reject.
replenish before I can build another
Remember
CMOD.
last
I don't know
night
what happened to my
said that
CMOD.
there
It
was
just
more
disappeared.
prudent course where you could just send it back to the states. Would you be willing to do that? And during the course of our discussion about his renewed request that we consider that option,
And I want to build
he
a 3-story
acknowledged to me,
aquarium.
we put it,
Oh, is that uranium?
both Mr. Eastman and myself are graduates
think that'd
of the
be
University
uranium.
of Chicago Law School. And he said, as graduates of that
oxygen.
august institution, you and I will mutually understand that the underlying legal plenary vice presidential authority is what you have to get there. Because this new theory, as I was pointing out to him, or the procedural theory, still violates several provisions of the Electoral Count, as he acknowledged. And the only way that you could ever be able to ignore several provisions of statutory law as if it was pretty clear that they were unconstitutional. And the only way they could be unconstitutional is if the vice president had plenary authorities that were formed the basis for the rejected votes as well. So he
Let's go check
acknowledged
out
in those conversations that
the rest of that
legal
cave,
theory
grab
was
some
the same.
uranium.
He just thought that the send it back to the states option would be more politically
There's a
palatable.
warper over there.
He hoped more palatable to the vice president for that reason.
And in fact, when Dr. Eastman made this concession during that meeting, according to your earlier deposition, Dr. Eastman said, just between us, University of Chicago chickens. Is that right?
Another crystal.
I don't think that the University of Chicago is going to start a Chicago Chickens fundraising club. But yes, that is the terminology that he used. He said, just between us Chicago chickens, we will understand as lawyers who have
Bunch of
studied
uranite
the
crystals.
Constitution that the underlying basis really is the same.
I reserve the remainder of my time.
So
Mr.
what
Wood.
Republican Jacobs
Jacob,
are
the president and vice president meet again on
Republican?
this. That's correct.
So after my extended meeting with Mr. Eastman that morning, during that time, the vice president had been back at his residence working on his statement to the nation, released the next
I'm gonna
day.
make a nuke reactor with all this.
Got down to the White House
All right,
some
that's
point between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock.
I hate caves. Oh, they make me so fucking. Oh.
Mr. Eastman was wrapping up, and when Mark Short and I went over to meet with the vice president, and actually we thought maybe we had good news. We felt like we had defeated Mr. Eastman. He was sort of acknowledging that there was no there. But the vice president was then
It's actually a
asked
pretty
down
benign
to the
area.
Oval Office,
There's warpers,
and he
but
went
that's
down
about it.
to the Oval Office while Mark and I stayed back in the vice president.
You weren't in that meeting.
I was not.
In the book Herald, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa write that the president said, quote, "These people say you have the power. Wouldn't you want to?" The vice president says, quote, "I wouldn't want any one person to have that authority." The president responds, "But wouldn't it almost be cool to have that power?" The vice president
I'm gonna
was
mark
reported
this
to have
cave
said,
so I can
"No,
come
look,
back."
I've read this, and I don't see
Shit,
a way
I
to
don't
do
have.
it. We've exhausted every option.
I don't know how.
I've done everything I could and then some to find a way around this. It's simply not possible. My interpretation is no." To which the president says,
I really
"No,
need
no,
a
no.
prawn suit. I need to
You
go
don't
to the
understand,
Aurora.
Mike. You can do this. I don't want to be your friend anymore if you don't do this." We asked Mark Short about this during his deposition.
An understanding that I would have. In other conversations with the vice president, he articulated to me that
Yeah, I
no,
definitely
he
want to build a
wouldn't want
base
that power
over here.
bestowed upon any one person.
There's like every resource known to mine. And I can run a nuclear reactor out
Mr.
here.
Jacob, did you, Mr. Short, and the vice president have a call later that day again with the president and Dr. Eastman?
Oh shit, I better go get some oxygen.
So yes, we did.
And what did Dr. Eastman request on that?
Oh, don't die.
On that phone call, which I believe was around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Mr. Eastman stated that he had heard us loud and clear that morning. We were not going to be rejecting electors, but would we be open to considering the other course that we had discussed on the 4th, which would be to suspend the joint session and request that state legislatures re-examine certification of the electoral vote.
That same day, January 5th, the New York Times ran a story about the disagreement between the president and the vice president about whether the vice president could determine the outcome of the election. Even though the New York Times story was indisputably correct, Donald Trump denied it. Trump issued a statement claiming that the vice president had agreed that he could determine the outcome of the election, despite the fact that the vice president had consistently rejected that position. Let's look at what the president said in his statement. Quote, "The The New York Times report regarding comments Vice President Pence supposedly made to me today is fake news. He never said that. The Vice President and I are in total agreement that the Vice President has the power to act. Mr. Jacob, how did the Vice President's team react to the statement from the President that the Vice President could take an active role in determining the winner of the presidential election?
We were shocked and disappointed because whoever had written and put that statement out, it was categorically untrue.
Vice President's Chief of Staff Mark Short had an angry phone call with Trump campaign senior advisor Jason Miller about this statement. Here's what Mr. Short and Mr. Miller told the committee about that call.
Okay. Tell me about the conversation you had with Jason.
It was brief. I was irritated and expressed displeasure that a statement could have gone out that misrepresented the Vice President's viewpoint without consultation.
The statement says the Vice President and I are in total agreement that the Vice President has the power to act. Is that incorrect?
I think the record shows that that's incorrect.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been through many documents that clarify that this is not where the Vice President was.
Right. So essentially, the President's sending out a baldly false statement about being in alignment, reported alignment with the Vice President, despite all of the predicates that you indicated had gone before about their respective positions. Is that effectively what happened?
I interpret the statement as false. I'll let you figure out who sent it out.
When Mark Short contacted you, he was upset. Is that what you said?
He clearly was not pleased.
Tell us what he said.
What's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting where only 2 people were in the room?
Did he ask you to retract the statement?
No, I think it went right to what's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting when only 2 people were in the room.
And he clearly disagreed with the substance, though, right? Because he said the Vice President doesn't agree with this.
I'm trying to think what exactly he said. I mean, the tone was very clearly that he used some language to strongly infer that the Vice President disagreed with that take, but I don't remember what that language was.
Did he dictate this statement?
He dictated most of it. I mean, typically on these I might have a couple of wording suggestions, maybe I have a sentence or a rough framework or something of that. But I know with specificity on this one that it was me and him on the phone talking through it, and ultimately the way this came out was the way that he wanted to.
So the dispute between the President and the Vice President had grown to the point where the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Mark Short, was concerned the President could, in Mr. Short's words, quote, lash out at the Vice President on January 6th.
And he did.
In fact, Mr. Short was so concerned about it that he talked with the head of the Vice President's Secret Service detail on January 5th. Here's Mr. Short.
Concern was for the Vice President's security, and so I wanted to make sure the head of the Vice President's Secret Service was aware that likely, as these disagreements became more public, that the President would lash out in some way.
After the recess, we will hear that Mark Short's concerns were justified. The Vice President was in danger. Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Can I throw that motherfucker?
Pursuant to the order of the committee today, Chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
Okay. All right, guys, I'm going to give an analysis here, and then I think we've got a handoff coming up that Asher can tell me who's coming up. So let me review what happened today in the hearings. Again, the hearings were excellent today. I'm just flabbergasted by how good these hearings are. And if I'm being honest, as I said to you guys before, I think it's because the Republicans are mainly in charge. Yes, Benny Thompson is the head of the committee, and it's mainly Democrats, and obviously Benny Thompson's a Democrat. But most of the questioning is, or a lot of the questioning is happening by Republican lawyers with Republican witnesses. And so that has a couple of positive things to it. It has one negative that not only are we covering the hearings live, you should always check it out with us. From what I'm hearing from the audience on My Facial Expressions Load, which I appreciate you guys saying that. That's fun, right? It's very serious stuff, but we're having fun with it. But also we're now getting your comments in, and we're showing those throughout the hearings. And a lot of you were frustrated in the beginning. I mean, Pence is getting all this credit. Liz Cheney is conducting a lot of this and now is getting credit for it. And yes, Liz Cheney is historically someone we disagree with a lot, and we will again in the future, and we do today on almost all the issues. Mike Pence is not a good guy. He's, in my opinion, a religious zealot, et cetera, et cetera. But two things here are important. One is you always have to be fair and honest and give credit where credit is due. If Pence had given in to what they described today as the enormous pressure, the unrelenting pressure by Trump to give into a fake legal theory that even the main lawyer, John Eastman, who was pushing that theory, knew was fake. And as the testimony showed today over and over again, he said that he thought they would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court based on his legal theory. It had no legs to stand on at all, okay? And every, again, Republican that testified today, whether they were on legal counsel to Vice President Pence, or it's Judge Ludick, who's right-wing Federalist Society Republican, they all say, of course the Vice President cannot unilaterally decide who the president is. And so they kept going back to the Jefferson never said that. They didn't even come close to saying that. It's all a fabrication. Under that theory, they said it several times. Then Gore could have declared himself the president in 2000, which is something I've been saying since the moment that it happened, since January 6th. I've been saying that, and the next one was like, please, somebody say it, and finally they did. Well, if that theory was true, then Kamala Harris can unilaterally decide who the next president is going to be. The voting would be irrelevant. You would have two sets of electors designed by Democrats and Republicans, as Trump wanted to do and his lawyer John Eastman wanted to do. And Kamala Harris would just get to say, I picked the Democratic electors, whether it's true or untrue. And now Biden will remain president. And by the way, he'll remain president ad infinitum, right? So it's an obviously ridiculous, absurd, and deeply un-American theory. But it's not really a theory. It's a fig leaf, right? So they just put it on for what is, in essence, a coup. So even Judge Ludick, who honestly was an awful witness, and I think that he was trying to appear somber and serious, and he takes himself very seriously. But I lost years of my life between his pauses, and his thoughts were elliptical, and were not. I followed the entire train of logic. I understood it, but it was not a great way of communicating what he was trying to say in an efficient and effective manner. So, but even he was saying the same things. This is absurd. No right-winger, no Republican, no American should think that one man can ignore the votes of the entire country and just decide the election. It's a preposterous theory. And it's deeply embarrassing that anyone who is conservative would have that theory. And that goes to the main question that a lot of you guys were asking throughout too, which is why is almost everybody here Republican? Why is everything being framed as these guys are the heroes and stuff? Well, number one, as I said earlier, Pence was a hero. I mean, yeah, it's a super low bar that he just said, no, I'm not going to
he barely qualifies as a
theory
hero
and destroy our democracy.
Like he did
Trump
the
wouldn't
least
have passed
amount
that bar.
possible.
Eastman wouldn't have passed that bar. Jason Miller, so many others didn't pass that bar. Pence did pass that bar, so give him credit. But the second reason is more important, guys. Because remember, Democratic voters largely already agree, right? And a lot of independents agree. But we're trying to convince the rest, or the committee is trying to convince the rest of the independents, and importantly, the Republican voters. Guys, you don't want this. You don't want the end of democracy. You don't want lawlessness. You don't want to burn our Constitution and destroy our form of government. This isn't right. And they're making that case very effectively. And they're doing it efficiently and crisply. And so if you're mad at me that I think it's mainly the Republicans that are organizing it, because I've never seen the Democrats be this effective and this efficient, sorry, but that's just true. So if it is mainly the Democrats that are putting it together, great, amazing, finally, competence, terrific. But it's important that everybody hear this. If everyone in the country watched these hearings, it would fundamentally change the way they think about January 6th and Donald Trump. Because not would it affect all Republicans? Of course not. There's probably about 3/4 of Republicans that are in an absolute Vulcan mind lock. Whatever Trump or Tucker Carlson or Hannity says, they will listen to it no matter what. If they told them, hey, rip the American flag and burn the Constitution, they'd be like, of course, the most American thing you can do is destroy our documents, destroy our democracy, destroy our government. Of course, yeah! So that's 3/4 of Republicans. I'm under no delusions about that, right? But 25% of Republicans, the majority of independents, that's all you need for sanity to rule again and to be dominant again. So, guys, this is of utmost importance because if this is not just about the past, and it's not just that if you don't punish the crimes of the past, that they will be repeated the next time the Republicans are in charge, and then we will lose our democracy. That's critical. That's absolutely true. But this is also about the future. Because and the present, because right now, if the election were held today and it was Biden versus Trump, which is the most likely outcome, I hope to God that isn't what it winds up being, but right now it would be that, Trump would win. He wouldn't win just the Republican Party. He would win the election, period. And this guy, who very, very, very clearly does not believe in democracy, is a thug. And yes, for God's sake, it is not 1% hyperbole. He is a fascist. He does not believe in our form of government. And he constantly uses the threat of violence to try to intimidate not only his opponents, but his own vice president, the Republican Party, other right-wingers. He says the absurd things to Pence that you saw at the end of the hearings, like, well, if you did this, then I wouldn't want to be your friend anymore. I mean, who says that? Either a child says that or a mob boss says that. I wouldn't want to be your friends anymore, if you know what that means. And you know what it meant the next day on January 6th is, well, what it meant was, I'm going to agitate everybody to be super angry at you.
Right. Have
then
them
they're going to
chant,
go in and break into the Capitol where you are, chanting about murdering
Mike Pence.
And then I'm going to put out a tweet after I know they're coming to get you, further encouraging them to get you, to physically end you.
Yeah.
That is what a fascist does. Trying to get his own vice president hurt
I know,
at the minimum and potentially murdered. It's real, guys. It's Republicans telling you it's real. It's Pence's team telling you it's real. They were actually, Trump was threatening basically physical violence against him. And Pence says to him in that final meeting, Mr. President, I'm positive that one man cannot unilaterally decide an election. I will not say that, right? Then Trump leans in and says, yeah, but wouldn't it be cool if one man could decide the election? I mean, again, his best case scenario is that he's a child, that he has the mentality of a 7-year-old, and I'm sorry to offend all the children out there. They're like, yeah, but wouldn't it be cool if I could just be president and you could just be the one person who decides I'm president even if I lost? Wouldn't it be cool? Or more likely, although both are potentially the correct answer here, that he's threatening him. And the threats were not subtle, both publicly and privately. And look, so the hearings are very important. That doesn't mean we're not going to have fun with them. We are. I mean, the frowning ladies in the background are unbelievable. The one behind Jacob Pence's lawyer, even when she was smiling, it was proud. She had permanent lines here. The guy on the other side looked like John McLaughlin's younger brother. We had a frown lady on the other side. We had the guy who speaks for all of us on the other side of Judge Ludiga. As he was talking, he was like, okay, we had the goat beard dude. Who's the cameraman in that row. So we had a guy. Now we have a new bad guy I never even heard of, Cheeseboro. He's one of the Eastman Trump guys, and his name is spelled Cheesebro. They even have a Cheesebro on their site. I mean, it's hilarious.
A Cheesebro.
As it's devastating. And then there's, of course, the great, like, the parliamentary talk, gentlewoman. I'm always amused by the word gentle. And now I present to you the gentlewoman. And when they have to, when the chairman himself is speaking, he has to quote unquote recognize himself. So he says this, because you know what, in my mind,
because it's like I'm reacting to this stuff, so I think it would be better to keep the delay.
Political consequences, the legal ramifications.
You know what I'm talking about.
But I'm also,
you know what I'm talking about.
An inner child myself. Honestly. So when they're like, and then Cheesebro says, "Oh, come on, dude! I can't believe we're having a conversation about Cheesebro." And then when Benny Thompson says, "I now recognize myself," and I think, I look in the mirror and I go, "I now recognize myself. There I am." All right, that's the goofy stuff. But the heart of it gets, and Jason Miller, wow. On the one hand, privately, as he's talking to the lawyers and he's under oath, he's saying, yeah, we knew that everybody thought we were being, quote, nutty, and that the theory that we were putting out there was, quote, crazy, right? But what did he do? He pushed it anyway! They pushed it anyway, and then you see him live on TV saying, of course we should do this, absolutely. What an unbelievable liar and hypocrite. It's amazing. And so, and then finally, the heart of this, guys, is the fake electors. And they finally started, and they even use the phrase fake electors. If you're doing fake electors and you're getting them to sign papers,
fake electors.
This is a matter of law. You are violating the law to try to end our democracy. And so that's why these hearings are super important. Okay, we are going to continue these hearings with JR now. So everybody, I'm going to bring JR in. Remember, whenever the hearings are on, we're on. We do analysis in between, and now they're back. And let's make sure we're watching. And then all of our shows have the best clips. And you can see all the clips on our shows, including JR's show, the watch list every morning. All right, JR, good to see you, brother.
What's going on, Cenk Uygur? How you guys feeling? Everybody can hear me, yes?
Yes.
Love it.
I'm going to let you take over from here since they're back and talking, all right?
They're right back in. Let's see what they're talking about.
Despite the fact that the vice president consistently told the president he did not have and would not want the power to decide the outcome of the presidential election, Donald Trump continued to pressure the vice president, both publicly and privately. As you will hear, things reached a boiling point on January 6th, and the consequences were disastrous. In the middle of the night, on January 5th, into the morning of the 6th, around 1 a.m., President Trump tweeted at the vice president, meaning that the comments in response to the president's tweet would also show up on the vice president's Twitter feed. The tweet stated that the vice president
I gotta
could
get that gravity
come
trap
through for us and send it back to the states. Then around 8 a.m. on January 6th, President Trump again tweeted, this time to say that the vice president could send it back to the states and, quote, we win. And that this is the time for extreme courage.
Okay, I need vehicle upgrade console.
As you can see, they're appearing to collect their notes, see what's going to be coming next. We're talking about the
deposition
issues today.
The vice president
I need a microchip.
started a meeting on January 6th in prayer. Here is what Mr. Short said.
You arrived at the vice president's residence.
That.
As would often be the case, I recall that knowing it would be an important day, we gathered in prayer. And often that would be
Alright,
something
we'll
the
have to get
staff
off and
member
do
would
lunch here in a
lead.
minute.
So it would have just been at that time, I believe, the vice president, myself, Greg, and Chris, and we would have just asked for guidance and wisdom, knowing
I
that
know I've
today
got a
was going to
microchip
be
somewhere.
a challenging
I
one.
can't have used it.
Mr. Jacob, did you go to the vice president's residences on the morning of January 6th?
Yes.
Who else was with you?
Mark Short, Devin O'Malley, our communications director, and Chris Hodgson, our legislative affairs director.
Did the vice president have a call with the president that morning?
He did.
Were you with the vice president during the call?
So we had been putting the vice president had finalized his statement.
What do I need?
Tonight,
Table
we were in the
coral,
process of
gold.
proofing his case and getting that out. And
Table coral,
we were told that a
gold.
call had come in at
I thought there was one in there.
the vice president stepped out of the room to take that call, and no staff.
The president had several family members with him in the Oval that morning
I need
for
more
that call.
table coral.
I'd like to show you what they and others told the Select Committee about that call, along with
How
never
am I
before seen
losing
photographs of
resources?
the president on that call from the
What is
National
going on
Archives.
here?
When I got in,
More table coral.
somebody called me and said that the family and others were in the Oval, and do I want to come up? So I went upstairs.
And who do you recall being in the Oval Office?
Don Jr., Eric, Laura, Kimberly, I believe Meadows was there. At some point, Ivanka came in.
It wasn't a specific, formal discussion. It was very sort of loose and casual.
So then you said at some point there's a telephone conversation between the president and the vice president, is that correct?
Yes.
When I entered the office the second time, he was on the telephone with who I later found out to be the vice president.
Could you hear the vice president or only hear the president sound?
Only heard the president. At some point, it started off with the commentary, everything, and then
The conversation
Shit on me.
was pretty heated.
I think still it became somewhat, louder tone. I wasn't paying attention to it initially.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what'd you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, my memory, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are a wimp, you'll be a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember.
It's also been reported that the president said to the vice president that something to the effect of, you don't have the courage to make a hard decision.
And I don't remember exactly, it was something like that. Yeah. Being you're not tough enough to make the call.
It was a different tone than I'd heard him take with the vice president before.
Did Ms. Trump share with you any more details about what had happened, or any details about what had happened in the Oval Office that morning?
That her dad had just had an upsetting conversation with the vice president.
Do you recall anything about her demeanor, either during the meeting or when you encountered her in James Keegan's office?
Probably need another.
I don't remember specifically. I mean, I think she was uncomfortable over the fact that there was obviously that type of interaction between the two of them.
Something to the effect, the wording's wrong. I made the wrong decision 4 or 5 years ago.
And the word that she relayed to that the president called the vice president, I apologize for being impolite, but do you remember what she said her father called him?
The P word.
Mr. Jacob, how would you describe the
Yeah,
demeanor of the
it
vice
just went
president
off.
following that call with the president?
When he came back into the room, I'd say that he was steely, determined, grim.
Of course, the most dangerous part of what Donald Trump did on January 6th was what he did himself. As will be discussed in detail in a future hearing, our investigation found that early drafts of the January 6th lips speech prepared for the president included no mention of the vice president. The President revised it to include criticism of the vice president and then further ad-libbed. Here is what the president said on January 6th after his call with Vice President Pence.
Let me make
Mike
my
is gonna do the
scene
right
off
thing. I
again,
hope
and
so.
I'll get off.
I hope so. Because if Mike
Dude,
Pence does the right thing,
module there.
we win the election. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. And we become president, and you are the happiest people.
Did he become president, or is it he becomes president? I think that motherfucker's got
And
it wrong.
I just spoke to Mike. I said, Mike, that doesn't take courage. What takes courage is to do nothing. That takes courage. And then we're stuck with a president who lost the election by a lot, and we have to live with that for 4 more years. We're just not going to let that happen. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And they want to recertify their votes.
Lubricant.
They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. And I hope he doesn't listen to the rhinos and the stupid people that he's listening.
Any more titanium?
Of course, we all know what happened next. The president's words had an effect. President Trump's supporters became angry.
Okay.
When the vice president issued his public letter, the crowd at the Capitol erupted in anger. Rioters who had erected makeshift gallows began chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Testimony in our investigation has made clear what the target of the rioters' ire was: Vice President Mike Pence. Rioters breached the Capitol at 2:13 p.m. Now let's take a look at what was going on at the White House at this time. We received testimony that the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, was notified of the violence at 2 p.m. and likely earlier. The testimony further establishes that Mr. Meadows quickly informed the president that he did so before the president
Well, what do we
issued
want for
2:24
lunch,
p.m.
my
tweet
love?
criticizing Vice President Pence for not having, quote, courage to do what needed to be done.
But I mean,
Here is what the president wrote.
Well, we have a lot of
in his
leftovers.
2:24 p.m. tweet while the violence at the Capitol was going on. Here is what the rioters thought.
Nothing but a traitor, and he deserves to burn with the rest of
Well,
them.
we don't have any
As
buttons.
this all escalated after Pence, what
We don't have
happened?
any buttons for them.
Pence didn't do what we wanted. Pence voted against Trump.
So we had
That's
mac
when all
and
this
cheese. Should I
started.
do some mac
Yep.
and cheese? Do we have
When we
some?
marched on the Capitol. We've been shot at with rubber bullets, tear gas.
Okay. Alright, I got a new scene now.
Welcome aboard, Captain.
That's right. You heard it here first. Mike Pence has betrayed the United States of America.
Welcome aboard, Captain.
Mike Pence has betrayed this president, and he has betrayed the people of the United States, and we will never, ever forget. Yeah!
It's real simple. Pence betrayed us.